Alright, we talk about some pretty complicated things in this course, and this is going to be especially true for our discussion of discrimination. I don't have anywhere near enough time to say everything I want to say about it, particularly in terms of all the areas we're going to approach. So I've picked one major thing I wanted to talk about in terms of gender discrimination, racial discrimination, and sexuality discrimination. So let's start with gender discrimination. What I really want to talk about are 5 different ways that gender stereotypes can affect us in our lives. So that's the idea that because you're a male, you have to behave or act a certain way or look a certain way, or because you're female, you have to do those things. So it's a far-reaching problem. Sometimes we think here in 2016 in America we don't have this problem anymore, but we absolutely do, and it's really showing itself in a lot of places these days, unfortunately. But the first area I want to talk about is physical appearance. Right off the bat, when we meet someone, we sometimes make a judgment about their gender based on how they look. So short hair is typically associated with males in our culture, whereas long hair is supposed to be feminine in our culture. If you're wearing pink historically in our culture, that was somehow symbolic that you were a female. Even down to babies, sometimes we'll say, oh, are they having a boy or a girl? Because I want to make sure I know what color to buy them. So again, the idea that the way we look indicates our gender somehow. The second is in terms of personality traits, and so when we ask people to describe masculine or feminine traits, sometimes for masculine we'll hear things like aggressive or assertive or dominant, or for females we'll hear passive, compassionate, caring. There's a long list, there's a litany of these personality traits that we associate with people based on their gender. The third I want to talk about is relationship status, and this actually applies to both heterosexual and homosexual relationships. So it's the idea that when two people, we're talking about two people relationships, when there's two people in a relationship, one should be dominant, going back to those personality traits, and one should be passive. So the idea is in a heterosexual relationship, the man is expected to ask people out on dates, or to pay for things, or to look out for the other person, to protect them. Whereas the woman is encouraged to not do those things and let the man do those things for her. This is all historically, and hopefully the smile on my face can tell you how passionate I am about all of this and how important it is we address it. Even in homosexual relationships, however, sometimes you'll hear two gay guys get asked who's the boy and who's the girl, as if even in that type of relationship there has to be a masculine and a feminine person. So relationship roles can have these gender stereotypes as well. The fourth area is in occupational situations. There are some careers that it's still viewed as a woman's career or a man's career. Again, much less so these days, but it still is unfortunately the case. And even with the same job, it is often found in surveys and studies that women make less than their male counterparts, even with the same experience, with the same position. Sometimes get overlooked for raises and promotions, so it still is a problem. And then finally, social status. So this is just in our general everyday lives. This is something that I'm even guilty of, and it's a lot to do with this undercurrent in our language and in our lives that we're not even aware of. So sometimes when I walk into a classroom full of people, I'll say, hey guys, how are you doing? And now I'm not walking in the room thinking I'm going to be, gender biased today. But in our culture, guys has become an acceptable term for everyone. But if I walked into a room and said, hey ladies, it's possible some of the guys would get offended. So even in the way that we, have those things viewed, sexuality is a completely different thing than gender, which I'll get to in a second. But the fact that boys who act feminine sometimes have it worse than girls who act masculine kind of deals with this social status, this undercurrent of, if a woman wants to be like a man, well, that makes more sense than a man wanting to be like a woman. Why would a man want to be like a woman? So again, I'm not saying I agree with that. In fact, literally quite the opposite. But sometimes that comes across in ways we're not even aware of. Gender is a really important topic these days, particularly because of people who are transgender having some of the issues that they're currently facing. The fact that even though they feel very strongly they are female or male, society feels compelled to tell them how they should live because of the genitals they have. Which psychology is very passionate about, making sure that people who identify as transgender are protected and are safe and have equal rights, and understanding that my perception of your genitals and what that says about how you look, how you act, who you date, who you love, and all that really shouldn't matter. It should be about you and how you identify and express your gender. One of my favorite things connected with gender is the idea of gender transcendence. It's the idea that it's kind of ridiculous that all of this matters at all. That if you identify as male, that's really the only thing that should say about you. You can be male, but be all these other things that people associate with female. In fact, gender transcendence says that masculine and feminine are completely ridiculous words that don't have any meaning whatsoever. Gender refers to just that, gender. And again, it's your interpretation of it. So, unfortunately, this is a problem in our society today that hopefully psychologists and people who are passionate about can get involved in and change the language, change the laws, and change how we treat each other. Unfortunately, that is also still very true in terms of race discrimination. So what I really want to talk about in terms of racial discrimination isn't the overt racism. It's still a problem. There are still people who have no problem vocalizing that they hate a race of people or that they think a race of people is not good enough. But you see hidden racism causing more problems these days. It's much less socially acceptable to be overtly or obviously racist. So it's these hidden racisms that are causing a lot of the tumultuousness and a lot of the damage in our society right now. So hidden racisms are not obvious, but they can be just as damaging. The first is symbolic racism. This is typically held by people who may be less educated. They tend to be conservative in their viewpoints. Again, we're not saying conservatives are racist. I'm going to get to something associated with people who identify as liberal in just a second. But it just happens to be more likely the case in that group of people. But symbolic racism is when you actively acknowledge that you have hostile feelings towards a race of people, but somehow you blame it on them. So someone who is being symbolically racist may say that I don't like black people because black people want affirmative action, or black people claim that they don't have the same rights or opportunities as white people, and it's their fault that all this is happening. So that would be an example of symbolic racism. That person doesn't really identify as racist, but they have hostility that they recognize. They just blame it on the group of people involved. The second type is that of aversive racism. This is typically found in well-educated people, and it is typically more often to be found in people who identify as liberal. So aversive racism is often found in people who are very actually on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of hostility. They often have a lot of compassion towards people of a specific race. Sometimes it comes across as sympathy or this anxiety that they're so afraid of acting in a racist way. But aversive racism can be problematic as well because it can cause a lot of different negative attitudes. It can perpetuate stereotypes, and it's this idea that sometimes you discriminate and sometimes you don't, but you really don't want to, so there's just a lot of anxiety and conflicted feelings about it. It's this feeling that it's unavoidable, but it's inappropriate. So that's the aversive racism. The third type is something a little bit different, but I wanted to talk about it in this conversation because it's so important, and it's that of microaggressions. Again, overt racism isn't seen nearly as much as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago, but microaggressions can be fatal. Microaggression is when, let's say, someone passes by of a different race and you pull your children tightly to them, or you're working in a shopping mall and someone comes in of a race and you watch them more intently to see if they're shoplifting. It's these tiny little things that can be problematic. But if you suspect someone of a crime because of their race and you behave in a certain way because of a microaggression, that can lead to devastating consequences. You're seeing a lot of violence in the media today, some of it perpetuated by police officers on African Americans. And again, the idea that a psychologist would probably throw at that, at least this one, isn't that that person grabs the gun and says, I'm going to go shoot a black person. But they interpret a situation as different and unfair and more threatening than it is because of these microaggressions. The person won't say that they're racist, they won't say they have racist ideas, but nevertheless they behaved in such a way that has caused this to transpire. Again, I'm not pretending like I can explain these things. They're so complicated. Each situation is unique, but we know that microaggressions can play a role. So again, racism is something that we all have to talk about. It's not like you're either racist or you're not. The ideas that we perpetuate in the same media that reports this stuff can affect us all in ways that sometimes we're not even aware of. Lastly, let's talk about sexuality discrimination. I really want to talk about 7 different areas where LGBT individuals can face difficulty. It's not to say that you will face difficulty if you're an LGBT individual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, but these can be areas that are more difficult for those folks just because of their status. So the first area is that of their personal health. Obviously, if you're in an unaccepting environment, that can lead to depression and anxiety and some mental issues. Also with sexuality, sexual education is an issue in and of itself, even with heterosexual behaviors. But people who are exposed to sex education aren't often exposed to sex education in terms of homosexual activity. So they may be less prepared for intercourse, or they may be less prepared for activities that can have an effect on their health. The second is that of their relationships, and that's just in general, their friendships, their family. They face this fear of being rejected because of who they are, because of something they can't change, something that there's something wrong with. And unless you've ever had to kind of carry that around with you, that's kind of a heavy thing, and it can have pretty long-lasting and devastating effects. The third is interpersonal relationships in terms of love. So it can be more difficult to find a gay partner or a bisexual partner because that person may have some hostility towards them from other people in their lives. They may be less open to relationships. They may have shame or guilt for their own feelings. It just can make it more difficult. There may be less gay people around. So there's a lot of things unique to that. Marriage for a long time was illegal for people who identified as gay. So that's something that has changed in the last few years, but obviously when you still see cases of clerks saying that no, they refuse to follow the law, that can still be problematic. So that can be an issue for LGBT individuals as well. Next up is children. I have some amazing friends in my life who finally were able to have children, but it was only after spending a lot of money and a long process of getting inseminated. Adoption is more difficult for people who are gay. There's still this undercurrent that gay people don't make as good parents. There's no research that supports that. In fact, there's some research that suggests that because homosexual parents have to work harder to have children, they actually are more likely to educate them. They're more likely to support them in some ways. So research actually indicates that they might have a very effective experience because they're being parented by LGBT individuals. Next up is occupation. It still is legal in many states for someone to be fired because they are transgender or because they are gay, because they have a sexual or gender minority. That's one of the last areas that is not protected by anti-discrimination laws. Even if you're not being fired, you may not receive promotions, you may not feel comfortable in your workplace. Every time you meet someone, you have to kind of figure out when you're going to identify yourself, if you're going to identify yourself, what their expectations are. So again, some people don't care and have a fine process with that, but for other people, it does create anxiety, and it's just something extra that someone has to think about. Next up is violence, and hate crimes still exist. We've seen some really extreme examples in the media lately where someone has this undercurrent of hatred towards people who are different in this LGBT way, that they feel justified in harming or even killing someone. And again, that's why all this matters so much, folks, because the few people who would be violent are fueled by all the negative attitudes. So even when you say something, like gay people are going to hell or I don't like gay people, that's fuel for these people who will actually be willing to do something violent about it. And then the final one is service to the community. We're talking a lot about interpersonal relationships, we're talking about things that just affect you, but society as a whole is negatively impacted when people aren't allowed to be themselves and share who they are and serve. For the longest time, you could be openly gay in the military, so that was one way that service was being limited because of this negative attitude. But even when you have people who aren't allowed to participate in community activities, or even if you're just looked down upon, it's this service to our community that's actually being limited. So again, briefest video ever on discrimination. I just wanted to view 3 different populations and talk about something significant in each one. It's such a big issue, and I'm so passionate that the only way we can really stop things is to all own our potential for discrimination and prejudice, and then to educate ourselves and actively try to do something about it. We also have to be empathetic. I can only view things from my perspective, and I can't tell someone how they should feel if I've never been through that situation. I can listen to them, I can ask them to see how they feel, but I shouldn't tell them as a white male what it's like or what they should feel like, in the same way that someone can't tell me as a straight person what it's like to be gay. So it doesn't mean we can't understand each other. We can. We just have to talk and understand that our perspective is not the same as everybody else's. Could talk about this all day. Don't know why I did that, not wearing a watch. But that is the briefest, shortest lecture ever on discrimination.